When you hear mercy, you never hear about justice. And that is a point Cardinal Burke makes, that you cannot have mercy without justice. When you divorce the two, it's not even mercy anymore. It's just tolerance of evil.
Recently, Cardinal Burke released a statement, a letter of sorts, and I found it very, very fascinating. And I was pleased to see Dr. Anthony Stine cover this for us in depth on his YouTube channel, which we are going to be linking to, of course, but you can find him at Return to Tradition on YouTube. He joins us this morning. Good morning to you, Dr. Stine.
Good morning, Joe, and thanks for having me back on.
I really appreciate your time and you being on the program. Let's talk about Cardinal Burke. Cardinal Burke has been interestingly silent, I think, over the past couple of years. He hasn't said too much. He has been very on the down low, we would say, quietly saying masses and doing good things, praise be to God, but at the same time, not at all outspoken. And then all of a sudden, we get a letter from him. And I thought what was most curious was the timing of the letter, since the letter wasn't actually new. What is going on here?
Well, it was written on the 9th of May this year. And it honestly looks like it was timed for release for World Youth Day and for some of the debates around the Synod on Synodality. Almost as a commentary on World Youth Day, because we saw there was a lot of controversy, we'll say, about some of the things that happened at World Youth Day, including the treatment of our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, debates that have come from, on the subject, do we need to give Holy Communion to 1.5 million people at a time? And in the past, the church would have said no, because at one time it was well understood that you are not obligated to receive Holy Communion every time you go to Mass. Even if you are in a state of grace, you are not obligated to receive. And somewhere along the line that changed. But he released this letter right in the middle of all that, or at the very tail end of it. And it almost was like he was holding it back, because his website, he's actually fairly active. He just doesn't publish things very often. He does keep a low profile. So I would say that this letter was released with some serious intent. And it begins with a focus on canon law, which is a very dry subject for most people. But he's using the reform of canon law as the sort of framing device for this, right? Almost to suggest that what you've been seeing going on in the church is illegal and quasi-legal at best. A lot of the use of certain terms that we're so tired of hearing, dialogue, accompaniment, and things, completely divorced from their traditional use in the common language of the church, and that the church has essentially gotten away from its primary purpose. After all, you don't need a code of canon law to know that the church is the first law of the church is the salvation of souls. And there isn't much talk of that anymore. Coming from like the higher up the ladder of the hierarchy, when you look, it seems the less you hear talk of the salvation of souls, which should be concerning for every Catholic.
Like, if your first thought isn't the conversion of souls, that should be rather alarming. Conversion of souls ought to be priority number one, not priority number 4, 5, or 6. And yet they seem to be totally tone deaf on this issue. And so at the end of the day, what is the power and weight of Cardinal Burke's letter here in this regard? Part of my challenge with the prelates in the church that are outspoken is oftentimes they'll say, Joe, you're being too critical. What do you expect them to do? And I think I've thought about that and said, well, I expect them to put on sackcloth and ashes in St. Peter's Square demanding reform and not leaving until they get a response. It's like, but yet we never see that. Is this their version? Is Cardinal Burke's letter like their version of sackcloth and ashes?
No, I don't think so, because I think the response I kept seeing in the comments on my video presentation on it was that there are people who will very bluntly say that they're not all that interested in what Cardinal Burke has to say until he fulfills his promise, which was to do a formal follow-up to the dubia. When he submitted the dubia 5 years ago, or whatever it was, 6 years ago, Canon 212, the Frank Walker's very good news aggregator website, has a ticker on there for how many days it's been. It has been over 2,500 days since the dubia was submitted. And Cardinal Burke said he would present a follow-up to the dubia, and that hasn't happened yet. And there are a lot of people who want him to do that, who will, whenever he does something newsworthy, remind people that he has promised to do that. And I think that would be the sackcloth and ashes moment. And I won't speculate as to why he hasn't done that. He made some sort of decision that it would do more harm than good. I don't know. That will be up to him. I think this letter instead is about really reminding people that there is a Catholic way of doing things, and that all this language of mercy and pastoral discernment and all this other stuff. When you hear mercy, you never hear about justice. And that is a point he makes, that you cannot have mercy without justice. And when he said, when you divorce the two, it's not even mercy anymore. It's almost just tolerance of evil. And I'm putting it in slightly blunter terms because many people have noted that this letter, clearly written for the average person to read, is not written in language that is accessible for the average person to hear.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is one criticism. As part of my criticism in the past has been, great bishops or good bishops, they speak out, but they speak out in ways that I don't find the most helpful. And, this might be one example of that. They write books, they give speeches. I think that's great and all, but I also don't think that most people read books. I think most, especially men, they don't like to read books. They'll listen to a podcast or what have you, but they won't read a book too often. So how many people are impacted by these books, or how many people are impacted by these letters? Commentators, talking heads like myself will go through this, but not necessarily your average layfolk, because they're probably receiving most of their news and information through TikTok or some other means, not necessarily through these types of sources. So what is your estimate on the impact of a letter of this nature from Cardinal Burke?
I would estimate that 75% of the people that are on his email list read it. My reading of it got around 16,000 views so far, and it'll get more in the coming days. And then after that, whoever else covered this on YouTube or in the blogosphere, but this is drop in the bucket kind of stuff, right? This is not large amounts of people. And I would like to think he'll spur a response from Rome, but they never responded to the dubia, which actually had canonical legal backing as a document. So I don't see why they would respond to this. Which is unfortunate. Any impact it can have would be to motivate those laity who are so engaged to pay attention to the writings he has, or what, talking heads like ourselves will do when we talk about these things, to then pass on to the public, to other people, the Catholics in our lives, what Cardinal Burke has to say on this stuff. Because there are still a fair number of Catholics who have this sense that there's something very seriously wrong in the church, but they just go about their daily lives. They're not engaged with it. Some have taken purposeful steps to not engage with the crisis in the church, saying that it doesn't impact their salvation. That is a decision they've made for themselves, and I won't judge anybody for it. But there are many people who are finding that they have their sins being confirmed by priests and high-profile bishops who just say, well, that habitual sin you have that sends 90% of men to confession, well, as long as you're fighting it, go receive communion and say an act of contrition, which is not something the church would have ever said. Any priest would have said until about 50 years ago, right? He, in the letter, goes after Amoris Laetitia. He never mentions Amoris Laetitia by name. It's also why I know this is not the replacement for his dubia follow-up, where he talks about, the changing of the canonical norms about divorce and remarriage and Holy Communion. He mentions that explicitly in the letter. But he does this sort of in passing, that these are like an assault itself on the rule of law and the sort of like the legal standing of sacred tradition for the magisterium and for our lives as Catholics. And this is not something to be taken lightly. And this is why I'm glad he released this letter, because Cardinal Burke is someone who has more cachet than, say, an Archbishop Vigano for a lot of Catholics. There are a lot of Catholics who were interested in what Vigano had to say until he started talking about Donald Trump being potentially the catacon and all sorts of this other stuff. And then some of the stuff he says about Russia these days, that he's burned some bridges with some people. Whereas Cardinal Burke stays like laser focused on the ecclesiastic crisis in the church, basically, and on matters of salvation. Most of the things he publishes on his website are actually just pastoral sermons on, for Easter and those other kinds of things that are always wonderful when he puts them out. But I would desire him to speak more on the crisis in the church, even if I have some personal differences with him on certain things, like the status of the SSPX and other things. His voice carries a great deal of weight. And this letter, I really liked this letter. I just wished it was, I hate to use the term dumbed down. I'd rather rather he wrote it to be more accessible, right to the New York Times level.
Yeah.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.